Okay. Right.
A bit to
Yeah,
me.
that's fine. Oh, yeah, of course, you can read.
Okay. It's frozen. Just one sec.
Oh, of
Yeah,
course.
it's
Ooh.
frozen. Right. Just waiting for it to. Ah, there we go. Right. Gone too far. Okay, Iris, over to you.
Hang on.
Can you see?
Oh, shit. I'm trying to make it bigger and it won't stay. Oh, that's it. The Torah section of Emor, Speak, begins with the special laws pertaining to the Kohanim, the priests, the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, and the temple service. A Kohen may not become ritually impure through contact with a dead body, save on the occasion of the death of a close relative. A Kohen may not marry a divorcee or a woman with a promiscuous past. A Kohen Gadol can marry only a virgin. A Kohen with a physical deformity cannot serve in the holy temple, nor can a deformed animal be brought as an offering. A newborn calf, lamb, or kid must be left with its mother for 7 days before being eligible for an offering. One may not slaughter an animal and its offspring on the same day. The second part of Emor lists the annual callings of holiness, the festivals of the Jewish calendar, the weekly Shabbat, the bringing of the Passover offering on the 14th of Nisan, the seven-day Passover festival beginning on the 15th of Nisan, the bringing of the Emor offering from the first barley harvest on the second day of Passover, and the commencement on that day of the 49-day counting of the Emor, culminating in the festival of Shavuot on the 50th day, a remembrance of shofar blowing on the 1st of Tishrei, a solemn fast day on the 10th of Tishrei, the Sukkot festival, during which we are to dwell in huts for 7 days and take the 4 kinds, beginning on the 15th of Tishrei, and the immediately following holiday of the 8th day of Sukkot, Shemini Atzeret. Next, the Torah discusses the lighting of the menorah in the temple, and the showbread, lechem hapanim, placed weekly on the table there. Emor concludes with the incident of a man executed for blasphemy, and the penalties for murder, death, and for injuring one's fellow or destroying his property, monetary compensation.
Right. Thank you very much. Okay. Something interesting, actually, Rabbi Sachs brings. I'm not sure I'd realize this. Don't know if it's in the Parsha or we learn it elsewhere. So, a Kohen generally can't become Tomei, right? The reason that Kohanim are buried on the edge of the cemetery is not because they're special necessarily. It's because so that when their families visit, they don't have to walk amongst the graves and therefore be too close officially to a dead body, which brings on what we call Tumas Mace, impurity. So interestingly, right, if so the wife of a Kohen, it makes sense, their children would be Kohanim. She's also buried in such a way on the outside, even though she's not a Kohen herself, right? But if you had a scenario, I'm trying to think how it would arise, where someone was a Kohen, but their family weren't Kohanim, what would the scenario be?
Second marriage?
Maybe something like that, yeah? Then there's no actual reason to bury them on the outside of the cemetery. It's not because they're special. It's only to facilitate visitation by the family. So there is one exception. So the Kohen Gadol isn't even allowed to have that with his own immediate family. So I don't know what the Kohen Gadol did at Levi. He obviously, by the way, it doesn't mean you can't go to Levi, right? Kohanim go to Levi's all the time, but you wouldn't stand too close to the mace. You wouldn't be directly involved, right? Once had a situation where a lady had passed away, relatively young, 50s, I think, quite sad, after cancer. Her sister was married to a Cohen. His boys wanted to help carry the coffin. In the US, they don't allow it because of health and safety. In the provinces, they don't seem to worry about that. They let the family carry the coffin, right? So the chairman of the Chevra Kadisha said to me, what should I do? I said, it's not really right, and we have a duty at least to mention them as Kohanim. Be more respectful not to, and they really shouldn't. And I think we did. I think they were slightly put out, but they didn't do it. Anyway, evidently there's an exception to this. I didn't know this. An exception is if there's what we call a mace mitzvah, which means somewhere where there's no family, there's no one to bury them, and the community make arrangements for it, right? It happens a lot nowadays, by the way. Somebody dies. The first you hear of it is that somebody, often Rabbi Brahman, because he's just very well known out there, gets a call from someone saying, I have a Jewish friend called Solly Cohen, and I know he's Jewish. He didn't keep anything, but he's Jewish and he's died and wants a Jewish burial. He's not a member of a shul anywhere, and you have to work it out. That's a mace mitzvah, right? It's where there's no immediate family to take care of arrangements, but we have a communal duty to ensure burial of Jewish dead. It's a big problem, by the way, because people know that. So people will say, well, no, my mother never belonged to a shul, but they'll phone up the United Synagogue and say, you have to bury her because she's Jewish. And they'll say, well, someone's got to pay. And there'll be a big argument about money. And if there genuinely is no money, they'll do it. But usually there is some money in the state. They just don't want to pay. So it seems that even the Kohen Gadol could actually break that for a mace mitzvah. So if there's no one else to take care of it, the Kohen Gadol could go and become Tameh. Now, also, remember, we're living in different times. Nowadays, the issue for Kohen is not, the Kohen doesn't have to go and do tahara and wash bodies and carry coffins and so on. Even if a Kohen goes to a levaya, the truth is, even if it's an immediate family member, the only practical difference is going to be that normally a Kohen wouldn't go into the hall with a mace, but for a family member, they could. But outside, there's plenty of ways that Kohanim can walk slightly further away and different things in halacha. So, but I imagine that's because we have a professional chevra kadisha. But if you go back to, I don't know, to the shtetl, presume, just like I said, in the provinces, the family carry the coffin. I'm sure in many shtetlach, people had to muck in and roll up the sleeves. There wasn't a professional chevra. So a Kohen might well be expected to do things, but he can't. He's a Kohen. So it's just interesting. It seems that for a mace mitzvah where there's nobody else, a Kohen's allowed. Anyway, by and large. So what are we talking about here? So the very beginning of Emor talks about the restriction on a Kohen that he's not allowed to become Tameh, which we will translate for now as impure, although it's a very simplified definition. Can't touch or be on the same roof as a body, right? Except for close relative. Kohen Gadol can't do that at all.
How close a relative?
Immediate family, somebody you would mourn for. So a sibling, a parent, an unmarried sibling, parent, or a child.
Not grandparents.
Or a spouse. Huh?
Not grandparents.
No.
No.
I had a very interesting situation once. Well, sad. Somebody was a Cohen. No, sorry. Yeah, he was a Cohen. And his daughter married a Cohen. So his grandchildren were Kohanim. And just to give it context, they knew that a Kohen doesn't go into the cemetery, doesn't go into the hall. So it wasn't like they didn't know, they knew. And at the grandfather's levaya, the mother was very adamant that the children should be in the hall with her. So much so that she basically said to me, it's wrong, Rabbi, you must tell them they have to honor their mother and they have to come in. It was a very, very awkward situation. Now, even if I'd said nothing, bear in mind the children knew, because their father taught them a Kohen doesn't go into the hall at the cemetery. So they were very uncomfortable with the whole thing. In the end, I think they did go in. I think I realized afterwards we should have done it outside, which would have resolved the issue, because outside a Kohen is not, the problem is being in the same room where you've got the same overhang. Anyway, but it was a very strange experience. And it wasn't like the kids didn't know and I could have just said, don't ask, don't tell type of thing, even though I don't believe that, but they knew. So they were very uncomfortable with it. But the mother was very adamant. She was very hysterical. It was a very difficult situation, actually. It troubled me a lot because I felt like it, on a certain level, it was emotional abuse. I'm sure she didn't intend it that way. But, if you have a child in a custody battle and one parent keeps kosher and the other doesn't, and they go to a non-kosher parent, and they're forcing them to do something that the child themselves knows they don't want to do, it's very difficult. Anyway, just by the by. Okay, so no, not for grandparents. So you'll have a situation where, yes, you'll have a grandparent who's a Kohen. The children will be there. The grandchildren will be in the Kohen room or separately or outside. But what is the Kohen room? It's separate officially from the hall and therefore not considered the same for purposes of Tumah. Now, if you ever learn the laws of Tumah and Tahara, of purity and impurity, certainly the red heifer, right, the ashes, the red cow that was used for cleansing, they're very strange laws. There is some logic. We had it last week with the Matzorah, and some of it, it said if the Matzorah sat on a seat, then you can't sit on it, you become Tameh, has to be purified. During COVID, we all knew about that. So some of it, we understand it's some kind of highly infectious thing that you can catch if you're not careful. But we don't really totally understand it. I mean, like in modern terms, so if you're under the same roof as a mace, you become tamei. But if you are the same distance from the mace, but there's no roof over you, then you don't become tamei. I suppose there is airborne, right? During COVID, we did things outdoors for this reason. So there are definitely parallels, but it's not totally logical. Let's see what Rabbi Yochanan had to say about it, just to be absolutely clear on this. Here we go. Who'd like to read number 1?
I'll read that. Rabbi Yochanan said, "It is not that death defiles, nor that the waters of the red heifer purify, rather than Hashem says, I have obtained. Sorry, you read it, friend. My voice.
I have ordained a statute and issue a decree, and you have no permission to transgress it."
Right. So you may know famously says that the red heifer, even Moshe didn't, even King Solomon didn't understand it. But the truth is, Hashem says, these are not logical things. It's not that death defiles and the water of the red heifer cleanses you. It's that I told you. Because I, Hashem, told you this, then you have to follow my laws. And I told you that death defiles, and that the red heifer, when you put the ashes into water, it cleanses. And why? Because God said so. It's a bit like I said a few weeks ago, a pig is not unclean physically. I know they wallow in the mud, but they're actually in some ways quite clean animals, evidently. But a pig is unclean ritually because God said so. There's nothing inherent about it. There's nothing unhealthy about pigs. There's no reason non-Jews shouldn't eat pigs, right? There's no reason to say that although the Torah says you shouldn't eat pigs, actually there's a health benefit to this. There's a health benefit to not eating milk and meat together. There's a health benefit to not eating blood. And therefore, non-Jews also should. No, in fact, not only that, but you may well know that when people get all bent out of shape about shechita, you might say, what's the big deal? And people say, they should label the meat that it's not been stunned before slaughter. People say, what's the big deal? Jews buy the meat and Jews know about shechita. So the answer is, the big deal is that when meat is shechted and it's found for any reason not to be non-kosher, usually the primary reason being the animal wasn't in full health, 100%, right? You find after death, the animal had some kind of ailment that means it wasn't in the best of health. It's therefore not kosher. We don't throw it away. We sell it to non-kosher market. So clearly we have no issue with non-kosher meat. We're just not allowed to eat it, right? So the only reason we can come up with spiritual reasons, but ultimately it's a chok, right? In fact, we know it says, Zos chukas haTorah, this is the ultimate chok. A chok means a law we don't know the reason for. This is the ultimate irrational law in the Torah, which the red heifer. So when you learn these laws, the Rambam has, Maimonides has in great detail, the laws of Tumah and Tahara, there are certain logical patterns to things, right? But you have to remember, it's not a rational, logical thing. It's a super rational, spiritual thing that God told us to do. Okay. So, and also, one of the things I often say to people is that often Tumah comes from a vacuum or an absence, right? So a person who is experiencing death, as holy as the body is, and we treat it with great respect, it's also an empty shell because the person has left this world and therefore there's a vacuum, right? What's the problem when a person gives birth? Why does a woman become nidar when she gives birth and she has to bring a korban? She has to go to the mikveh. So some people say, very interestingly, you've probably mentioned this before, it's fascinating, that maybe there is an element of bereavement because you're grieving the small person that's no longer in your body, which would explain postnatal depression, right? Why should a person be depressed? You should be over the moon. So I don't know if there's a proven link, but there is a view that says that the reason for this tumah is that the body has lost, for a good reason, right? It's expelled the fetus because it's alive and well, but still there's a loss, right? Menstruation represents a loss of potential life. There's a vacuum, there's a loss of a life that could have been. So you're tamei and you have to correct. But this is all like nice kind of explanations. The reality is it's a chok, the Torah tells us, right? Saras also, we said last week, right? This illness is not really leprosy that can affect your house and your clothes, right? It's not a medical condition. So these are all spiritual phenomena. They may or may not have somewhat rational explanations, but ultimately it's a spiritual thing, right? Sometimes, unfortunately, there's an obvious overlap. So, for example, when it comes to women and menstruation, right, in many cultures that was seen as unclean. I always remember some of the more bizarre experiences of my life are, I know of two situations where a school or university set up a Muslim prayer room and it caused problems. I'm sure there are more. One was a certain university, I think it was a university, or maybe it was a school. Maybe it was a particular school. I don't remember who it was, but that they'd set up the Muslim student said, can we have a prayer room? They said, sure. Here, you can use classroom, whatever. Lunchtime, it's not in use as long as you just tidy up after yourselves. And then another group of students says, can we have a prayer room? They say, what for? He says, Muslim prayer. So you have one already. He said, oh no, those are Sunnis. We don't pray with them. We're Shiites, right?
Yeah.
You're like saying we need an Orthodox shawl and a Sephardi shawl and a Reform shawl and a, right? The other one was that there was a University of Glamorgan had a Muslim prayer room. I don't know if it was a chapel or a prayer room. And I'm not saying this to make fun. I'm just saying this matter of factly. I do find it a bit strange, but it's probably got its roots in Torah. That whoever it was, imam or whoever it was, said we have a small problem that women, when they're menstruating, are unclean and they can't come into a mosque. So the cleaners who come to clean the mosque, the prayer room, can't do it if it's their period. Right? So can you imagine asking a woman in today's world, right? You can't work when you have your period. That wouldn't go over very well. I don't know how they resolved it. Maybe they had male cleaners. Judaism doesn't actually say that. There's a common myth, for example, that women during times of menstruation shouldn't touch a Sefer Torah. There's no basis to that whatsoever. There are certain things you don't do, including being with your husband. Yes, it is true, but it's not cleanliness in the physical sense. It's unfortunate in many cultures it was seen as unclean, probably, and therefore, as soon as you say the word tameh, people assume that. But a better translation is A, an absence or a vacuum of some kind that leaves a space, and B, something that's beyond us, like with the red heifer. Why does a red cow purify? Who decided that the ashes of a red cow purifies? It makes no sense. It's almost as silly as Donald Trump saying drink bleach during COVID. People have forgotten that, yeah? What else do we have that's a bit kind of interesting? So in our Parsha, we have a Kohen who has a physical blemish. He's not allowed to serve in the temple. Why not? Very strange. All these things seem very superficial, right? You know, a person who's come into contact with a dead body. Okay, no, so what? A person has a physical blemish. So what? It seems very superficial, right? You might say, as many perhaps people who are not as respectful of faith generally would say, stuff and nonsense. Does your God really care if your priest is blind or not? Surely it's a beautiful thing to have a blind priest. Does your God really care if you touch the dead body? Right? It's one of the most common questions that Christians ask Jews, and sometimes Jews ask other Jews is, does Hashem really care if you light your candles at 5:21 or 5:22? Is the world going to fall in? Are you going to get struck by lightning? If you light your candles 1 minute after Shabbos comes in, surely it's about what's in your heart. Right? They say, rabbis often joke, people often say, Rabbi, I'm a good Jew in my heart. I don't do very much, but I'm a good Jew in my heart. We say that's why I have so many cardiac problems, right? Because you're putting a lot of strain on your heart. Yeah. So why should outward appear? Is that a heretical question? Well, it's not, because that question is actually asked in the book of Samuel. Let's have a look. Who'd like to read?
I'll read, Rabbi.
Oh.
The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart.
Okay, so which is it? Is it external appearances, and therefore you can have a blemish that affects your ability to do things, or you can have a physical situation in the case of touching a dead body that affects you in some way? Or is it all about what's in the heart, like I just said? Which is it? So the answer is you're right, and you're right too. There's both these things are relevant. How do we understand any of these things? So first we have to understand what holy means. So what do we mean when we say that something is sanctified in Judaism? Right? We sanctify space. the Mishkan, the temple, the shul, right? The Shabbos table, the home. We sanctify space, we sanctify time, Shabbos, Yom Tov, times for davening, times for doing mitzvahs. Now, God is beyond time and space. We say it in Adon Olam, right? But he created time and space. And that is why, what is the Hebrew word? We've done this before. What's the Hebrew word for a world, anyone?
Olam.
Olam. What is the root of olam? Anyone know? So the root alam or ha'alem actually means concealed or hidden. So why? Because what is this world? It's a place of concealment. What's the concealment? Concealment is the godliness. If you're a mystic or if you attended the Tanya Shir from the beginning, we talk about something called tzimtzum, that you have this blinding light, which is God, and it's too bright. And in order to create a world, God has to basically say, look, it's a bit like if you ever want your kids, I'll give you a much simpler analogy. If you're a teacher, if you ever want your students to learn how to do equations, at some point you have to stop helping them. Right? If you always say to them, oh, do this, do that, they'll never learn. Right? It's very tempting. It's really hard, particularly when you're in a hurry to go somewhere, right? I suspect a lot of kids don't learn to tie their shoelaces. Why? Because, you're trying to get them out to school in the morning, they haven't done their laces, and it takes them 10 minutes to figure out how to do their laces, and you can do it in 1 minute. So you do it for them. Gavi's not very good at putting his socks on. He asks us to do it for him. Like one of these days, he's going to say to him, you need to get up 5 minutes earlier and take a few minutes to put your socks on. But in the absence of doing that, we end up doing it for him. He's never going to learn. So if Hashem would be revealed fully in this world, there'd be nothing for us. It'd be too much. It'd be too blinding. So Hashem says, in order for the world to exist, I have to basically keep stum. I have to conceal myself because it's too powerful. It's like looking at the sun, right? In order to have you could actually, maybe the sun's a good example. It's not just the sun's light these days, it's the ultraviolet rays as well. People know about skin cancer. In order to enjoy the full benefits of the sun, right, you have to have dark glasses, or you have to make sure you don't look directly at it. You have to have sunscreen if you're going out directly in it, so you don't get skin cancer. So you might say the sun's a terribly dangerous thing, it should be banned, right? Well, no, the sun gives us light and heat and lots of good things, helps us figure out times, but proceed with caution. So if imagine God as a blinding light of energy, of spirituality, although he's not really, because he's not anything, but the closest we can come is this infinite spiritual light, which would just overwhelm us like it did at Mount Sinai when we passed out. So it's too much for us. So it needs contraction. So it contracts, and this world, we don't see God revealed. I was thinking about it myself this week, as a rabbi even, I talk to Hashem 3 times a day. I don't get clear answers, but then you get answers because things work out for you in a certain way, and you think, oh, yeah, actually, that's B'Shem, that's worked out really nicely. But it's not a direct answer. Very challenging. Person could say, listen, Hashem, I'm doing all these mitzvahs. Just talk to me already. You talked to my ancestors. Say something to me. Tell me you're there. So what happens is, you're walking down the street and you don't get hit by a car, but you miss it by a split second. And Hashem's saying, you see, I'm looking out for you. But you don't necessarily appreciate that. Why? Because it's a hidden world. We don't see open things. It's very tough. But the reason for that is so we can exist. Otherwise, it'd be too much for us. It'd be too blinding. We couldn't do anything. Nothing would be so. But if God was completely hidden, then he may as well not be there at all. So what do we have? We have Kedusha. What's Kedusha? Kedusha is sanctity. Every mitzvah we do, or a place that's set aside that has a sanctity. What does Kedusha mean? It means it's a place where we reveal a little more of that godliness. It's a place where the physical and the spiritual interact. Right? What are those places? So physical places, ultimately it's the tabernacle and the temple, the Mishkan and the temple, and time it's Shabbos and Yom Tov. So there is a physical dimension. So what is Tumah? Tumah, interestingly, is not really about death, it's about mortality. So it's about realizing the difference between us and Hashem. Hashem is infinite and we are finite. So Tumah is something that touches on our very holiness, that when we experience mortality in some form, whether that's contact with a dead body, whether that's the loss of, right? Interestingly, it seems, even, I think we did this once before, birth also. Because once you're born, it's downhill from there. You're going to die one day. So although birth is miraculous and beautiful, you don't even have to go as far as to say that a woman who gives birth experiences loss. You could simply say that birth is also a reminder of mortality, right? Because you're born and you die. It's a nice reminder of mortality because it's new life, but it's also ultimately limited, even if it's 120 years. So all these things have one thing in common. They remind us of the limitations of this physical world. Sorry, yeah, someone's going to speak? No? Oh. So when you have something that's so sensitive, because it's very finely tuned. If we have too much holiness, like Aaron's sons, or like the people in Jerusalem that get Jerusalem syndrome, when people in Sfas that go a little bit mad, then it's too much for us. We lose the plot. On the other hand, if we don't have it, then it's we don't appreciate godliness in the world. So it's very fine tuned. It's very sensitive. Kedusha, anything that's holy is very sensitive. So the temple is a very sensitive place. So you can't go there if you're tamei. You can't go there if you have some physical imperfection. As superficial as that may sound, that's because it's a physical place, right? You can't go there if you've had contact with a dead body. Why? Because a dead body reminds us of our mortality, whereas God is infinite. So there's a dissonance, there's a jarring there that we have to somehow correct. And interestingly, also, what does Saras do? What does skin disease do? It reminds us of our physicality, if not our mortality, right? So it seems like it's a little bit of a stretch, but maybe there's nothing wrong with a person who has a limp, but it reminds us of our physicality. And the temple is a spiritual place. Anything that draws attention to our mortality and our physicality is something we discourage in that space. Right? What's saras on a garment or on a house? We said it's probably like some kind of mold or some kind of rot type of thing, right? It reminds us, if your house has dry rot or whatever, it reminds you that it's just bricks and mortar and it's not, it's not eternal, unfortunately. It needs work. So there's nothing wrong with these things, but it reminds us of the difference between God, who is infinite, and us who are finite. Very interestingly, in the book of Job, and therefore, sorry, when we have that intersection, which is anything that's holy, that's kedusha, whether it's a holy place or a holy time like Shabbos, or any mitzvah we do, it has to be done with great sensitivity so we don't upset that balance. The book of Job, if anyone knows the story, it's an awful story in many ways, right? Hashem is chatting with Satan, and Satan says, let's just remind ourselves, in Judaism, there's no kingdom of good and kingdom of evil. But when we talk about the Satan, we're talking about basically an angel who is sent to tempt us to do things we shouldn't do. And our challenge is to ignore it, right? It's like a mystery customer who mystery customer walks into a shop, decides to be particularly difficult. And they've been sent by management. Hopefully what they want is for you to be amazing shop assistants and treat the customer with great respect. They don't want you to fail and have to fire you, but it could go wrong. So the Satan is our mystery customer sent to tempt us into trouble, but ultimately he's just doing his job, which God gave him. So in the book of Eob, in the book of Job, no pun intended, he loses his children, he loses his wife, he loses everything. Right? And God says, look at that. You see, he's holy. And Satan says, you try afflicting his body and see what happens. And I didn't even realize this before. I looked it up in the book. It's so interesting. He covers his body with sores. And Job, it says he took a pot shard, like a broken piece of, pottery to scratch his back. Imagine, you're itching all over. And that's when he breaks. I think we quoted this before. That's when he says, I wish I'd never been born. So the loss of his family can take, the loss of his livelihood, the loss of his home. But when he's actually afflicted on his body, it's too much for him. Let's see the quote. Who would like to read number 3? Anyone? Julian, do you want to read?
Okay. The adversary departed from the presence of the Lord and inflicted a severe inflammation on Job, from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. Afterward, Job began to speak and cursed the day of his birth.
Right? So that he never cursed until then. All the sorrows he had, he bore them with stoicism. And it was only when he was, you think, on the scale of things, okay, it's very annoying to be covered. I'm itching, just thinking about it. To be itching all over is very annoying. But at the end of the day, it's not as bad as losing your whole family.
At what point in the story did this occur?
So after he's lost everything, and God says to Satan, you see, he still believes in me. Satan says, yeah, you try afflicting his body and see what happens. And it says he broke out in sores, and then he says, God, I wish I would never have been born. I curse the day I was born. Right?
Rabbi,
Yeah.
well, is it maybe the straw that broke the camel's back then?
Right. Yeah. So I always love the story about the kid that walks into the shop and he says, you know, can I have a glass of milk? And they say, that'll be £1, please. And he says, I'm still thirsty. Can I have a refill? They say, sure, that'll be 50p. He says, gosh, I wish I'd had a refill in the beginning. I would have saved 50p. Right? It doesn't work that way. You're right. It's cumulative. I'm sure. But the other point is that what ultimately pushed him over the edge was his physical suffering. When you see a physical affliction, you know, people when they have children with special needs, they often say that as hard as it is other kids in the park saying, look at that boy, he's got a funny face or whatever, it's the adults that are the worst, that stare and don't know what to do. So what does skin disease do? What does Taras do? What does I don't know if Job has Taras, I think it was boils. It reminds you of your mortality. Again, maybe not you're about to die from it, but it makes you realize how physical you are. Now, in the context of a spiritual world, of physical world of spiritual concealment, that's a very delicate thing. So anything that reminds us of our mortality, a brush with death, a loss of potential life, a physical affliction which reminds us that we are human bodies that will ultimately wither and die one day, is something that's counter to that kind of kedusha. It's an idea. Rambam said that when you're hungry or thirsty, homeless or sick, you can't think about meditating on truth. When you're personally afflicted, it sounds strange. Surely it's worse to lose your family. I mean, what could be worse than that? But somehow when you're personally afflicted, it drives you insane. You can't be philosophical about it. You can't even think. There's a chap called James Kugel, apparently is a biblical scholar, who published a book about his experience with cancer. And he said when he was told that he had 2 more years left, in fact, he was cured in the end, which helps lots of people. He says when he learned that he was about to die, the way he described it was that the background music stopped, meaning that, you know, you go through life and everything's just, you know, there's things going on and life just, you sail through life. And then suddenly, when you're conscious of your mortality, you sort of become removed from that. You're no longer part of that. You suddenly sort of, you know, everything stopped for you. And he also writes a very interesting thing. This is what he writes. Who would like to read? No, I didn't put his quote. Sorry. He writes, most people, when they see someone ravaged by chemotherapy, tend to keep their distance. I'd say this particularly with a child. You see a child with leukemia who's bald, you don't know what to say. You just keep your distance. When we see a person who's physically afflicted, we often do one of two things. We often say the wrong thing, or we say nothing at all. Right? People at Shivers feel awkward. They don't know what to say. When you see someone suffering bereavement, you don't know what to say. Right? And it's not always the answer to say there are no words, but at least it's an expression. You know, I found myself when someone has a particular tragedy, you want to send a message, it seems very trite to just say, wish you long life. And if it's for someone particularly young or something particularly heartbreaking, I think the message I usually send is, I was so sorry to hear of your loss. There are truly no words. I wish you long life. Because they don't have to find something clever to say. You know, we struggle, but I think there's a lot to be said for that. You know, you see a person who is in some kind of physical discomfort or has some physical ailment or some disability. Unfortunately, human nature is to avoid it. We don't like dealing with our mortality. Maybe that's a stretch to say that's also mortality, but it's all to do with the fact we're physical beings. Therefore, you see someone who is physically different, you struggle with it. We shouldn't, but we do. It's not new. Let's see what King David said in Tehillim. Who would like to read?
I'll try this time.
Go on.
My friends and companions stand back at the sight of my affliction. Even those closest to me keep their distance.
Wow. So David HaMelech said, when they see I'm afflicted, right? He had many afflictions through his life. He was chased by different people, right? He had bereavements, all kinds of things. His own son turned on him. And he said, what do my friends do? Even my closest friends, they keep their distance. Wow. Why do we do that, by the way? I think it's probably the same reason that, if you recall with Madeleine McCann, everyone was very judgmental about the parents. Oh, they left them on their own, and who would leave their children like that? And, you know, it's a terrible thing. There were allegations they even drugged the kids and all this kind of thing. And you're thinking, you know, I don't know, tragedies happen. It could be they were negligent. I don't know. But at the end of the day, tragedies happen. Why are we all so quick to judge and say, you know, oh, you know, they did this and they did that? Why can't we have compassion? And I think the answer is because we all like to convince ourselves it wouldn't happen to us, right? Oh, I would never do that. I wouldn't let my kid get snatched. I wouldn't let my kid get burned in boiling oil or whatever it is. And the reality is we all know accidents happen, unfortunately. And there but for the grace of God. Right? In the words of Hamlet, the heartache and the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to. Right? We go through all kinds of physical things in life, and it shocks us. That's the bottom line. And our natural reaction often is to recoil, to stay away. So tuma doesn't mean defilement. It means something which makes us aware of our mortality. It distracts us from infinity and eternity. It reminds us of our physicality in this world. You can't get more physical than death. When you touch or have contact with a dead body, it is a stark reminder of your mortality. You need a reset. That reset is going to the mikveh, going through purification. So the Mishkan represents God in space. Shabbos represents God in time, which, by the way, was very rare because most religions and cultures, right, what view did they have of the physical and the spiritual? It was like, you know, as we say, Hashemayim Shemayim Hashem, V'aretz Nasan Livnei Adam. The heavens belong to God, and the earth is given to man. They're two separate realms, and never the twain shall meet. Right? Although we say that, but we know, of course, in reality, we do a mitzvah, we bring them together. Most religions don't have that concept. Most religions and cultures, either it's just a bohemian sort of culture, eat, drink, and be merry because tomorrow you snuff it, and just make the most of life in this world and have all the pleasure and the enjoyment. Or it was, you know, go live on a mountaintop and be celibate and live on bread and water. You know, Christianity certainly has a very sort of ascetic kind of view of things. I think Islam also to a degree, right? In many cultures like Buddhism and, you know, monks and whatever. Judaism says, no, live in this world. Eat, drink, be merry, get married, procreate, have relationships, laugh and love and enjoy the physical world, but sanctify things, sanctify time, sanctify space, sanctify actions, right? Sanctify eating by eating kosher, making a brocha, sanctify intimacy by doing the context of marriage and taras mishpacha, right? Sanctify everything that you do by doing it through the lens of Torah. It's quite a unique aspect of Judaism, but that comes with a certain sensitivity. So when we have something that's a very stark reminder of our physical being, then we need to temper that. So if you look at all the things that bring tumah or that are forbidden in the Mishkan, it's often to do with that. It's to do with something that somehow makes us all too aware of our physicality. It's not that they're dirty, they're unclean, they're impure, they're wrong. It's just that they serve as a sort of prompt, as it were, and therefore they need to be managed very carefully. And that's why we're so strict with all these things. And by the way, that's why we're so strict with Shabbos. Shabbos is an oasis in time, then we have to manage what we do and don't do on Shabbos. The Mishkan is an oasis in space. We have to be very careful what we do and don't do in the Mishkan. Let's see what Rabbi Sachs has to say to conclude. Who'd like to read?
Shall I go?
Go.
The holy is the point at which heaven and earth meet, where by intense focus and a complete absence of earthly concerns, we open up space and time to the sensed presence of God, who is beyond space and time. It is an intimation of eternity in the midst of life, allowing us at our holiest moments to feel part of something that does not die. The holy is the space within which we redeem our existence from mere contingency and know that we are held within the everlasting arms of God.
Quite a lot of long words there, right? But so it's this fusion where we take the limits of this world, space, time, mortality, and we infuse it with godliness. It's every mitzvah we do. It's particularly felt in the temple and the Mishkan, and of course, when it comes to time, like Shabbos, Yom Tov. That's why we have such strict guidelines that we're learning about the laws of Shabbos in order to be able to refine ourselves to that point. So coming back to the question, does God care if I light my candles a minute late? Well, the answer is yes. There's a very sensitive balance. When we're taking this very physical world and we're infusing it with spirituality, which is infinite and which is boundless and has no limits of space and time, have to do it in a very sensitive, very controlled way so we don't get it wrong. And that's why it does matter. You can't just say, oh, I'm spiritual, I love God, I'm a Jew in my heart. It does matter to follow these laws. I suppose the important point is that they're a means to an end. The end in itself is not being Shomer Shabbat in the technical details, but it's what that then brings about in terms of the spiritual aspects of it. And the same for any mitzvah we do. So when people laugh at, why are we so careful? We have to eat the right amount of matzah and drink the right amount of wine. Does God really care? The answer is these are very sensitive things. In the same way that if you were doing anything else that required sensitivity, if you were taking medicine or if you were doing a recipe, depends what kind of cook you are. But let's say you're following the recipe, you're going to measure things out exactly because you want to get it right. If you get it wrong, it's going to mess it up. So it's the same thing with holiness as well. Sometimes it may seem very technical, but it's all part of finding that sensitivity and that balance. And that's why, at least in Orthodox Judaism, that's why observance and fealty to halacha is so important. But it's not the end in itself. It's the means to an end of finding that balance. Right, nearly 11 o'clock. We've done quite well today. Just going to stop sharing. Any questions or comments before we finish?
No, what you were mentioning before.